Hello, and welcome to the next installment of our 2020 Trans Wellness Summit. We're here tonight talking with Dr. Benjamin Lannon from Boston IVF, and we're going to be discussing fertility and reproductive options. Stumbled over the word there, sorry. So if you're joining us on our homepage, which is www.transwellness.me, like the state of Maine, then you'll see a chat box to the right of the video. To use this chat box, you just have to enter your name and hit join. And then you'll see a little blue box that says ask at the bottom. You can use that to ask a more formal question, which you can even ask anonymously, just in case you're embarrassed about showing who you are asking it. So feel free to use that chat to make any questions or comments that you may have. If you're watching this on Facebook, I'll be trying to pay attention to that chat, but it's certainly a more sure way to make sure your questions are seen if you go to the website. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Lannon.
Hi, everyone. Go ahead. Thanks very much for joining. And thanks, Gray, for organizing this and asking me to participate. I'm really excited to be here. And this is what I do for a living. So I'm really excited to talk to you about different options that exist for transgender people. So I'm going to kind of switch back and forth between video of myself and some slides. I will try to keep people paying attention, and I'm glad that I'm doing this tonight and not competing with 75-degree weather last night. So hopefully people are snuggled in for this part. So I'm gonna share my screen here and just start out with an opening slide. So the topic tonight is gonna be fertility and reproductive options for transgender people. And my name and information are at the bottom there. And I'm going to go through and I'll take questions in the chat and I'll answer them sometimes as I go, or we may circle back at the end. So I want this to be fairly fluid and not too tedious. So I'm going to switch here to the outline of the talk. In general, I'm going to go over sort of a little bit about myself and Boston IVF and who we are and what to expect if you ended up coming to see someone like me. We're going to talk about some different options for fertility preservation. So these are options that might happen prior to somebody going through a transition. And we'll talk about the difference between preservation of testes and ovaries and sperm and eggs. And then we'll talk about options for people who have gone through transition. Sometimes that would be a surgical solution and something that's permanent, but also we'll talk about options for non-permanent transition, mostly hormonal therapy, and how that might affect fertility. So we'll talk about sperm and egg options in those settings. And then I'm going to make a distinction between options for reproduction. So this is not so much about protecting the sperm and eggs, but actually when you are ready to start a family, we can talk about the different options that exist, including insemination, IVF or in vitro fertilization, something called reciprocal IVF, which is where we use eggs from one person and someone else's uterus. And then we'll talk about egg and sperm donation options, and then gestational carriers. So each of these is a different pathway, and depending on the individual or couple that we're working with. And so we can kind of go into depth of each of those things. So I'm going to just jump out of the screen here and just speak a little bit about who am I. So On the title slide, it says reproductive endocrinologist. And this is one of these things, when I talk to my kids, they say that's a terrible name for a doctor. Their description is basically you're a baby maker, which is a little bit true, but in general, reproductive endocrinology is a subspecialty after obstetrics and gynecology, and we deal with all of the hormonal aspects of reproduction, from menopause, from menstruation and puberty all the way to menopause. For many people in the trans community, you may interact with a medical endocrinologist who also deals with hormonal things, and many of them, or you may work with somebody who specializes in care of transgender individuals dealing with hormonal treatment. I have not really worked a lot in that area. I have training in it, but it's not my primary specialty. So mostly I deal with the preservation of eggs and sperm and the options for getting pregnant. So as my kid said, you're a baby maker. That's true. And, to the extent that we need eggs and sperm, that's the area that we deal with. On a personal note, I live in near Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I have a wife and 2 children, and I have 2 cats that I have locked out of the room so that they cannot invade this Zoom meeting. Or Vimeo meeting, sorry, brand loyalty. The other thing I want to say is just sort of who are we? What is Boston IVF? So Boston IVF, if you don't know, is a practice that has been in existence for over 30 years. It started in the Boston area and now has centers throughout the New England area and even in different parts of the United States. And we're one of the biggest and most experienced IVF centers in the world, but we also deal with lots of other aspects of fertility and reproductive care. My practice is in the Maine Center, so we are based right in South Portland, and we have a local team there. We deal with people throughout the state of Maine, and even some into Canada and northern New Hampshire. So, when you come to see us, or if you make an appointment, our goal is to listen to your story, explain your options, and as they pertain to you specifically. So there are different things that pertain to different people. And then offer different treatments if it makes sense for you, or talk through the different scenarios that are out there. And, I want to say that we intend to deliver this sort of free of judgment and prejudice. I think for anybody interacting with a medical specialist, sometimes it feels like a very intimidating experience, or that you're going to have to explain a lot. And I think people, when they come to see us, realize that we deal with a lot of different things, and a lot of it is kind of awkward for anybody to talk about. We're talking about sperm and masturbation and all of these things that people don't really talk about in their general conversations. So working with the trans community is something that reproductive endocrinologists have done for a long time, and a lot of these techniques have been around for a while, and they're getting more and more prevalent. And I think as a society, we're more and more comfortable talking about these things and dealing with them. And so it's only something that we want more and more to provide access. And as I was preparing for this talk, I feel like I wanted to just make a disclosure that I'm sure many of you understand, but I think as a society, we've come a long way in dealing with transgender issues and gender issues and sexuality and everything. And the medical community and profession has come a long way, but we're still working through a lot of stuff, and we certainly haven't perfected it. So I think when again, when you come and interact with the healthcare system, there's still just a lot of things that aren't smooth or slick or really well thought out for sort of the trans community or anything like that. And so, again, it's not because we're ignorant or trying to be hurtful, but I think there are still things that we are trying to work on to improve for everybody. And I wanted to show this next slide because it sort of highlights one of these things. So this is a picture that I took in our building, and it's a restroom, obviously. And so the original sign was the one that's below, and it has, like very stereotypical sort of female, male bathroom. And then, somewhere along the way, we said, okay, well, we should, make sure that this has, handicap accessibility. And then it's all sort of labeled in that way. And the medical profession is really, all about categorizing and labeling things. And so it's hard for us when things aren't fitting into a simple label. And so as we said, okay, well, we should try to be more inclusive and make sure that we're not discriminating or making people feel welcome. So somebody put up these new signs, and it's a good concept, right? And it says all gender restroom, which I think is great. But then the images are just sort of still the same. So you have a female, a male, and then, the third person is kind of wearing like this sort of jaunty kilt looking thing. And I just think, it's sort of, the intention was good, but it misses the mark. And that we're sort of saying, all right, well, there's this third category of people that doesn't quite fit into the first two. And I think that's not how anybody wants to portray this. So, this, I think, is just a good example of people trying really hard, but still using the same system of categorization. And so, one of the things that we've really tried to do when people come to fill forms and things like that is to take out as much of the gender-specific language and be really clear about what we're asking. But a lot of times it comes down to fundamental biologic components that you may or may not have, whether it's testes or ovaries or uterus. And so separating out those just basic facts from all of the things that we link to them it has been challenging. And so, as I said, I think that's not an excuse, but I just, it's a plea to acknowledge the fact that we care about these issues, and I think everybody's working on them. And signage is a good indicator of the fact that people are trying, but not always capturing things perfectly. So let's sort of move into the meat of the topic here and talk about some basic things. So to make a baby, we need three things, essentially. One is sperm, one is eggs, and the other is a uterus. And each of those can come from somebody. In a cisgender couple, you have, the woman with the eggs and the man with the sperm, and the woman has the uterus, and all of the roles are sort of relatively clear. But in our practice, that doesn't always play out that way. And sometimes we have couples that are using an egg donor or a sperm donor, or they have a third person carrying a pregnancy for them. And so a lot of those principles are the same, whether you're cis or trans or gay or straight. We're trying to sort of piece together these components to make things happen. So sometimes we may have a single person come in and they say, I have sperm and I want to try to get pregnant, and we can make that happen. We need to have somebody provide eggs, and we need to have somebody provide a uterus, but those are things that people will sort of offer to donate, or through, you can essentially pay for those services essentially to use somebody's uterus or eggs. We may have a couple and they are both have ovaries and a uterus, and they may use one person's egg and the other person's uterus and a sperm donor. So, as I said, I don't have a judgment, or there isn't like a right answer as to how to do this, even with our, cisgender couples or straight couples. People are sometimes choosing these more complicated pathways. So that's why I say, I think, sometimes if you're coming in and you're transgender and you feel like, oh, there's this sort of crazy thing that I'm asking to do, it's sort of part of what we have conversations with everybody about a lot of the time. So, who donates and all of that is a question, and who's going to carry the pregnancy, but there are lots of different ways to go about that, and we'll kind of come up to that. So the reason that this becomes relevant is that some of the gender-affirming treatments and hormonal therapies that are used in transition are potentially going to impact the sperm or the eggs or the uterus over a period of time. And I think one of the main points is very few of those are not reversible. So we have the ability to stop some of these treatments, and we'll talk about this, but and then use the eggs or the sperm or the uterus as needed. But I think mostly the first part is to talk about, okay, well, what can we do to preserve for somebody who's starting out before they have made the decision to transition or gone through any procedures? What are the options that exist? So we can start with that one. So I spent some time at Boston Children's Hospital when I was training, working in their transgender medicine clinic, and worked with a lot of young kids that had gender identity issues and were ready to discuss transitioning with their parents and medical providers. And so, as we all know, this isn't something that is a decision that only happens to adults or anything like that. So those are things that have to be carefully worked through. And I'm certainly not going to go into all of the psychosocial aspects of care in those young children, but there are opportunities for freezing or taking a part of an ovary or a testy and to freeze them. The reason this is an issue is if you are doing anything before puberty has happened, it's very difficult to obtain eggs or sperm from that child, and so there are ways to potentially take a piece of the gonad, the ovary or the testy itself, and preserve that. These are much more experimental and not something that we deal with on site. It's a more sort of specialized thing, but we have the ability to connect anybody if they are, need to access those services for a younger child. When we get to puberty, so maybe it's somebody who's 15, 16 as a boy or girl and are making decisions about transition, the options are a little easier. So then we can start to work with sperm or with eggs. And for sperm, it's conceptually easier to go through because it's easier to get sperm out of the body. Eggs are inside the body and hard to remove, but sperm is easier to remove. Now, again, depending on the age of the person and their comfort with masturbation and all of that, it can be not totally easy, but in general, if that can be accomplished, a sperm sample can be produced, and then it can get analyzed, and it can be frozen. And the technology to freeze sperm has been around for a long time. Sperm is very small. It's not very complicated biologically. And so it's very easy to freeze. The cost of doing this is something in the sort of $400 to $500 range to freeze sperm. And then there's some sort of ongoing storage costs. But for the most part, it's not a extremely expensive or complicated procedure. We have sperm banking on site, and we can, connect people with longer term storage facilities if they're thinking it's going to be for many years. But that's a service that we have available to us. Working with eggs is a trickier situation, as I said, because eggs are naturally in the body. So in order to get eggs out of people, what we do is stimulate, or we basically try to recreate a menstrual cycle. So again, this would be somebody who is not on any medication to suppress ovulation or menstruation, but from the start of the cycle, you could essentially stimulate the ovaries to produce multiple eggs. So naturally, humans ovulate one egg in a month, but we can stimulate ovary to produce multiple. This is basically the process that we use for IVF, and it was developed for those purposes. It usually takes about 2 weeks of this hormone. It's a naturally occurring hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates the ovaries to produce an egg. And in that time period, there's a little bit of blood work and ultrasounds to monitor everything. But after those 2 weeks, the eggs will be ready to be retrieved, and they would be capable of being fertilized if we wanted to. The process of retrieving eggs happens in an office, and our office in South Portland does this. I do this every day, and it takes about 15 minutes to do it. It happens under sedation, so people are totally comfortable and essentially asleep for it. And I'll show you a picture of kind of what this looks like. So this is a sort of medical graphic of an egg retrieval. So on the left image, there is a picture of a uterus and a fallopian tube and an ovary, and you can see the ultrasound going into the ovary and or into the vagina, and then the needle is passing through the vagina into the ovary. There's not much else in between there, so that needle can kind of pass directly through, and we can safely access the ovary. The egg is floating around in a little pool of fluid there, and so we can suction the fluid out and collect it in a tube. That's the picture up to the right there. The fluid gets captured in a tube, and then we can take that fluid and pour it out and look under a microscope to find the eggs. There are people who are specialized lab personnel that work with me that help collect and manage the eggs. And the bottom picture in the black and white is an image of what this all looks like on ultrasound. So you just see these black circles that you can put the needle into and drain. So that process, as I said, is a sort of a 15-minute procedure. And as soon as we take the eggs out, we look at them, we make sure they look okay, and then they can be frozen. And whenever you talk about freezing things, people sort of think of chicken and broccoli, and you're like, how can it be good to freeze an egg? If, when my chicken comes out of the fridge or the freezer, it doesn't taste as good as it did before. So we're not really using commercial freezers here. The way that we freeze eggs and sperm is in vats of liquid nitrogen, which is one of the coldest substances on Earth. And so we take an egg, and the reason it's difficult to freeze eggs is it's a more complicated cell than a sperm. It's a big ball of fluid. And if you think about taking a beer bottle or a wine bottle and putting it in your freezer and leaving it overnight, a lot of times that bottle will crack because water expands when it freezes. So when we put if you just put an egg into freezing liquid, it will explode. And so the way we have gotten around that is by actually extracting all the water from the cell itself and then freezing it so quickly that it doesn't have time to form ice crystals. It actually just forms like a bead of glass. It's called vitrification, and it's a very effective way of essentially suspended animation for the egg and for sperm. And so it's able to be frozen, and it can sit dormant like that for many years. And then when you thaw it out and warm it, it will go back to doing its normal function. So it's sort of crazy, but it works very effectively. The challenge with eggs is it's much more expensive to freeze eggs than it is to freeze sperm. So a process like this can cost somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000. And it's not that there's one really great thing that costs $8,000 to $10,000. It's just a lot of little things that add up. Unfortunately, insurance companies don't really cover these things yet. Hopefully someday we'll be able to get this kind of stuff through in insurance coverage. But one of the biggest challenges that we deal with is that there is a difficult access to care in this situation. And if you are fortunate to have the funds to do this, that's great, but it can be a barrier for a lot of people. And it doesn't have to be an absolute barrier. We have a lot of options to help people with financial aspects, but it is, it's a reality of the situation. So those are the options for somebody who hasn't, undergone any surgical or hormonal transition, but is thinking about it and wants to do this. So sometimes I will see teenagers who are making these decisions, and generally we will have a parent come in and help with consent process and everything. But it's more and more frequent as we're seeing people making these decisions earlier in their life. I would say the more common thing that we deal with is people coming in some phase of transition. So a lot of times they have been on testosterone or estrogen for some period. Again, sort of freezing sperm or freezing eggs. And those things, for many years, people would say, oh, well, once you have taken hormones, you can't really do any of these things. And that's just not true. And we have done a lot of work in this area. And we've done some studies showing that with the right management, these things can go perfectly well, and as well as anybody who had never been on any kind of hormone. So estrogen and testosterone both sort of work like birth control in some form, and so they kind of shut down the reproductive axis, and but it's not permanent. So the process of sort of reversing the hormone is not doesn't need to be permanent. It's obviously a difficult thing to come off of hormones that you've been on for some time, often years, and so there can be physical and psychological effects to shifting your hormones very quickly, and so we have to do that in a smart way and make sure that it's not causing too much distress in the system. But typically, for example, for eggs, if you've been on testosterone for however long, usually if we stop the testosterone or taper off of it over a 3 or 4 month time period, the eggs will kind of go back to resuming their function. We don't, again, sort of going back to having periods and all of that can be obviously not ideal, and so we don't need to drag this out for too long. But there is going to be some time where we have to transition off of that hormone in order to get the eggs. And we've worked with a lot of people in this situation, and it's generally fairly well tolerated. Same with sperm. Sperm usually takes about 90 days to go through its life cycle, and so it takes a little bit of time to come off of the estrogen and let everything come back, and then usually within sort of 3 to 6 months you'll see some recovery of sperm. There is also going to be a resumption of testosterone, but usually it's not long enough to start seeing long-term effects from or side effects from the testosterone. It's more just getting the sperm to resume function. Once we transition off of those hormones, the process for freezing sperm or freezing eggs would generally be the same. And some of this depends on age. So if you're already on treatment and you're in your 20s and you don't have any particular urgency to getting pregnant in the near future, you may just say, I'm going to just stay on this and deal with it when I'm ready. And as long as you don't wait too long, you have time to just deal with it in the next topic that we're going to talk about, which is just options for reproduction. But the basic idea of all of this is to kind of figure out what your options are, come up with a bit of a game plan in terms of, okay, well, when am I going to do what and what does it look like? And, that might be, hormonal planning, financial planning, all of that. And we can help kind of strategize some of that based on whatever your specific needs are. In terms of options for reproduction, again, this is sort of when it's time to make a baby and get pregnant. And so what we've talked about so far is sort of getting to the point where there are eggs or sperm that are available. Now, if that was done earlier, then we can use the eggs or sperm that were frozen in the past. Again, one of the questions that we always start with is whose eggs, whose sperm, and whose uterus. We need each of those things, as we talked about. And so as long as there's a connection to those, we prefer not to work with somebody who needs to get all three. But as long as somebody as an individual or a couple has one of those things, and then we can kind of piece together the rest. So as I said, sometimes it may be one person's eggs, another person's uterus, and sperm from a donor. It can be one person's sperm and then a donor egg and a gestational carrier. All of those things are possible. Like everything in terms of cost, when you need somebody else to donate these things, they increase in cost based on how hard they are to come by. So getting a vial of sperm might cost you around $800 from a donor. Getting a set of donated eggs can be in the $18,000 to $30,000, depending on how that all goes, because somebody else is having to go through that whole egg retrieval process. Gestational carriers are people who are going to carry a pregnancy for you. You may have heard of the term surrogacy, which is a little bit different, but the general idea is somebody who agrees to carry a baby. It's not their egg, but it's someone else's egg, someone else's sperm, and then they're carrying the pregnancy. Those can be much more expensive because you're asking somebody to essentially work 24 hours a day for 10 months. And even if you paid them minimum wage, that's still a fair amount of money. So those can be in the sort of $50,000 to $100,000, depending on who it is. Now, if you have somebody who's willing to do that for you, that obviously makes it easier, but that's one of the areas that can get quite expensive. So for trying to conceive, there's intrauterine insemination. So putting sperm into the uterus. So often if there's a donor sperm and we're using somebody's uterus, It's around $500 to do one of these procedures. We basically take the sperm and put it into the uterus at the right time of the cycle, and that can be relatively straightforward. And we work with many couples doing this and for different reasons, but the general idea is we're just trying to get the sperm where it needs to be at the right time of the cycle. If we are needing to connect sperm and eggs in a different way, then that's where IVF comes in. So if the eggs are coming from somewhere else and having to go into someone else, then mostly we're fertilizing the eggs outside of the body. And this starts out like the process we talked about earlier of getting the eggs. And then when we put them together with sperm outside of the body, we can grow them in a little incubator for several days. And that would take the sort of rest of the in vitro fertilization process forward. And so we can grow embryos, and then we can place one of those embryos back into the uterus. I can show a picture of what that looks like. And so here's a uterus, and here are the ovaries, that same kind of picture. We basically take a little catheter that slides into the cervix and release the embryo into the uterus. This is a relatively painless process, similar to a pap smear essentially, but depositing that embryo into the uterus. And then the rest of the process involves the uterus and that embryo connecting with each other. This is a picture of what it looks like on ultrasound. So we place an abdominal ultrasound, and we can watch the catheter go into the uterus and go from there. So those procedures are sort of, again, a carrying forward of that process of retrieving eggs. And so it adds a little bit more cost. Typically, you're into the sort of 15 to up to 20,000, depending on how all of that works. So again, the cost thing is a big factor, and I don't want to focus on it, but I also don't want to ignore it, because I think sometimes we talk about all of these things as if they're great procedures, but then you say, okay, well, can I actually afford to do that? And so we have, it's part of the conversation that I have with everybody. We have a financial services department. We have people to help you kind of figure out what, if you have coverage for anything, what's covered, what's not covered, what are the short and long-term costs and all of that. And that's, as I said, a big part of the planning and something that we can help. It's a major purchase like anything in life. And, for many people, getting pregnant and having a baby is free. But doesn't mean that it's unattainable. It's a different priority if you have to go through some of these procedures. I'm going to pause because Becca asked the question, how long does frozen sperm keep? Really good question. So essentially forever. Sperm, as I said, is very easy to freeze. It's simple cells, and we can freeze it. And there's a certain point at which people aren't going to keep using their sperm, but certainly for, at least 10 plus years, the sperm will be stable. Also, eggs are stable for a really long time. There are people who have used embryos after like 20 years and they've still worked. So it's pretty crazy. There is something about, there's a question here about embryo freezing. So in an IVF cycle, if you make embryos and you have extra, you can make a decision as to what to do with them when you're done having your own children. There is some decision to be made. Some people will discard their surplus embryos, and there are some people that will donate their surplus embryos. You can donate them to other people. You can donate them to research. The question here is about, embryo adoption. We don't use the word adoption because it's not really the same concept. So there is a sort of legal definition of adoption. which is based on a child, an embryo, and this is where it gets into very tricky politics, and a lot of the stuff that goes into abortion legislation and all of that crosses over into our field very quickly, because if you assign personhood to an embryo, then suddenly that embryo has rights that can change how its outlook is legally. So we allow people to discard embryos freely, and we don't refer to it as a life. Now, again, there's a lot of religious and legal and all sorts of definitions around what is a life, and this is gets to the root of what we are talking about a lot in our political discussions. But there are some Christian groups and adoption agencies that work to help people avoid discarding their embryos and request that they are donated to other people. They're very good at it, and it cuts out a lot of the cost, and it helps work with helps people use embryos that have already been made. But it can get a little tricky legally, because there's a family with children who are biologically related to that embryo that are out there. There is also a Christian overtone to a lot of those agencies where they will allow the embryos to be donated, but they kind of do a home study and want to make sure that they are going to Christian families. And that's stuff that I have zero judgment or opinion on, other than to say it's not a medical decision about who deserves embryos or not, and so we try not to sort of wade into those waters. But a lot of the embryo donation services are kind of couched in that language. So and it overlaps with the sort of anti-choice religious movement around assigning embryo personhood. I won't get into a very long and complicated discussion about all of the legal matters, but there a lot of what we do in IVF is sort of under potential threat with changes in how we define life, and so it's stuff that we have to be careful about what words we use when we're doing all of this. I will sort of summarize my talk, which is to say, there are a lot of different options. There are a lot of different time points in which you can enter and leave the process of this. I think a lot of transgender people that I talk to have gotten the impression that they've closed a door, or that there's no chance for them to have a family of their own because of decisions that they've made. And I think a lot of that thinking is sort of outdated and not really fairly considered. And so there's very few situations where we can't help. Definitely, cost is going to be a component to everything. And so depending on what you're trying to accomplish, there may be things that are sort of cost prohibitive. But if somebody waved a wand and said you have all the money in the world to spend on your reproductive options, we can pretty much solve everything. And it certainly may involve other people. So depending on your personal situation, or if you're in a couple, sort of what you have for eggs and sperm and a uterus can impact where this all goes. And some of it can be very simple and straightforward, like insemination with donor sperm, and some of it can be very complicated using an egg donor and a gestational carrier. So we can work with everybody across the thing, but we're happy to talk it through with anybody and sort of talk about what are your family building goals and how can we help you achieve them. So with that, I'm going to pause. I will take any other questions. I'm going to just share my contact information. So the easiest way to connect, if you go to our website at bostonivf.com, there's a link that says Ask Rhonda. Rhonda is a real person. She works in our office. She's not in Maine, but she's been with our company in Boston for almost the whole time. And she knows just about everything. And you can click on that link. You can send an email and you can just have a conversation about information. It doesn't require that you set up an appointment or pay any money or anything, but we really want to make sure people have access to information. The website also has a lot of information that bostonivf.com. If you want to speak to somebody directly, you can email, you can call and speak to people, and they will help you figure out, even if you're not sure what you're asking, they will help you figure out what the right way to enter the system is. And as I said, I'm happy to meet with anybody, talk with anybody, and even if you don't know exactly where it's all going, just to sort of understand what your specific issues are and where to go. So so I'll pause there, and we'll see if there's any other questions or things that come up on the chat. And thank you very much for listening and for considering this issue, which is really an important one, and I think will only grow in awareness as more people from the trans community are going through these treatments and reproducing. And I think we've seen the same sort of changes in the lesbian community and the gay community who have gone through and sort of paved the way for a lot of these treatment options to be available to everybody. And I think there's only room to improve on our end and explaining services and creating access for transgender community as well. So thank you very much for your attention and questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lannon. Once again, this is our final video in our 2020 series. We'll have another online series like this in spring of 2021. And we'll be talking then about substance use. So thank you so much, Dr. Lannon. Giving it a couple moments here just to make sure we don't have any additional questions coming in. I haven't seen any come in on the Facebook. Well, in that case, we will have this video up for another week on our website, and then it will go away. But thank you so much, and I hope that we can welcome you back sometime, Dr. Lannon, for another wellness summit, maybe an in-person one in the future when we're not too worried about transmitting disease.
It will be great. And spring 2021 sounds like it. Oh, Becca's got one more question. Hold on. It's down to the wire live. We'll hold for you, Becca.
Take your time, Becca, but no need to rush.
That's fine.
I'll tell a little anecdote while we're waiting for a question to come in. It's kind of interesting to me talking about this. Is the first presentation I've ever witnessed or been a part of on the side of fertility and reproduction of people wanting babies instead of trying to prevent in pregnancy. I spent a lot of times telling young trans men that testosterone will not guarantee birth control and that they still need to be careful about that. And so it's very interesting engaging in this side of the conversation for me.
Yeah, well, I started my career in a community health center in Boston, working with mostly people who ended up with pregnancies they didn't want, or trying to figure out how to prevent pregnancy. And you know, a lot of the stresses and challenges are the same on the other side of the coin. It's just a different group of people. But you know, controlling your reproductive story is a really important one. And whether it's from prevention to, you know, helping people, I think that's it's a really important topic. And I think, you know, one that people don't always think about, but it's yeah, I'm glad that we're talking about it here, and I hope to continue to have discussions about it moving forward. So Becca's question was, does it matter how long someone is on hormones before their sperm is frozen in terms of viability? I would say not really. It may take a little longer to have resumption of sperm function if you've been on hormones for a really long time. But it's very variable in any individual. When you stop taking the hormones, your brain, as it, you know, I said like birth control, and I think Gray brings up a good point. It is not pure birth control, but when you stop these hormones, the normal function of the brain will kind of go back into rhythm, and then the natural hormones will start to sort of resume on their own. So yeah, it's a personal choice, but I would say, you know, somewhere between 3 and 6 months is typical for sperm and egg function to resume after, for most people being on any kind of treatment. Great.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Speaking in under the wire. All right, well, thanks, Gray, for organizing, and I hope everyone has a peaceful winter and a peaceful transition to 2021, and we'll see you in the future.
All right, have a great night, everyone. Thank you for watching.
Take care.